Well, good evening, visitors. Welcome to the Australian War Memorial's Last Post ceremony, which today commemorates the 50th anniversary of the attack on fire support patrol bases Corporal and Balmoral during the Vietnam War. My name is Richard Cruz, and joining us today from the Australian Army is Lieutenant Colonel Chris Anderson. We warmly welcome the family of Corporal Robert Bernard Hickey, whose story will be told shortly. We're honoured to acknowledge the dignitaries, senior defence personnel and members of Parliament who are joining us for this evening's ceremony. Today we are particularly honoured to welcome the Vietnam veterans who fought in the battles of Corporal Balmoral. We are proud of you and we sincerely thank you for your service and sacrifice. We welcome the veterans who have served, those that are still serving, and the families that love and support them. We are saddened to hear of the passing of Brigadier Geoffrey Shelton today. Brigadier Shelton was the commanding officer of the 3rd Battalion Royal Australian Regiment at FSB Corporal and Balmoral. Our thoughts are with his family, friends and colleagues, and we are honoured to acknowledge his service. We acknowledge the members of RSL and Services Clubs Association, RSL Victoria and RSL Queensland, who are watching the broadcast of this ceremony across Australia. During this evening's ceremony, wreaths will be laid at the base of the Pool of Reflection by family and visitors to the memorial. Australia's Federation Guard is a tri-service ceremonial unit of the Australian Defence Force. They provide a ceremonial presence at civil and military events and during visits to Australia by foreign dignitaries. The Guard will now dismount the catapult party from the tomb of the unknown Australian soldier within the Hall of Memory. To mark the 50th anniversary of the battles at Fire Support Patrol Bases Corporal and Balmoral, I will shortly introduce the colours and devices from the artillery, armour, engineers and infantry corps who fought in these battles. The practice of carrying symbols into battle has existed for centuries. Colours were used by the British originally as a means of identifying the location of the regiment's headquarters in battle. In time, the colours became a focal point of regimental pride and loyalty and there are many stories of exploits of great heroism by soldiers defending the colours from loss. When battle honours were added to colours, they became a record of the military achievements of a regiment and were held in even higher esteem by members of the regiment. The consecration of colours was seen to add religious significance to them and, through the colours, to the regiment and its duties. Colours were carried only by the infantry and cavalry regiments. Other regiments, which were responsible for skirmishing ahead of the major formations, did not carry colours because they did not always wish their location to be known, and also because of the greater risk of loss of any colours to the enemy. After 1881, colours were no longer carried in battle because of the improving technology of weapons and the greater distances involved in warfare. However, they remain a strong focal point for a regiment and continue to be held in great esteem and accorded great respect. The colours and devices paraded today, which proudly bear the battle honour Coral Balmoral, are the 1st Armoured Regiment Standard, the guions of the 3rd and 4th Cavalry Regiments, the Royal Regiment of Australian Artillery, the banner of Queen Elizabeth II, the Royal Australian Engineers Sovereign's banner, the 1st Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, Queen's and Regimental Colours, and the 3rd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, Queen's and Regimental Colours. The escorts of the colours and devices will now take post. I would now like to invite the Director of the Australian War Memorial, Dr. Brenda Nelson, to the lectern.
Australians, all let us rejoice, for we are young and free. We are Australians, defined less by our Constitution and the machinery of our democracy than we are by our values and our beliefs, the way we relate to one another and see our place in the world, our triumphs and our failures, our heroes and our villains, and the way as a people we have faced adversity and how we will face the inevitable adversities that are coming, and how we will respond to new and emerging unseen horizons. The events that bring us here today changed lives, and they changed us. We pause here today in the heart of the land they loved, half a century after the heroism of those who fought at fire support bases Coral and Balmoral. We do so in honour of those who died in our name and the 61,000 Australians who served, fought, suffered, died and were wounded in the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War inflicted deep wounds on many of these young Australians. Many returned, bearing emotional wounds denied healing by many who shunned them as reminders of a war that they opposed. In this, we failed you. We emerged from the Vietnam War, a deeply divided people, yet now determined to learn from the experiences of those who went in our name and our responses to them. And we have. With gratitude and immense pride, we say to you that what you did in Vietnam, at Coral and Balmoral, is as valued by us as those young Australians who landed at Gallipoli, who held the line at Kokoda, endured at Kapiong, or fought under our flag and our name in the dust of Uruzgan. 50 years ago today, 2 Australian infantry battalions, 3 artillery batteries and support units established Fire Support Base Coral. As dusk descended on the evening of the 12th of May 1968, so too did unease. The Australians stood at enemy infiltration routes. The threat had been seriously underestimated. By nightfall, in pouring rain, base defences were only partially completed with companies and support units dispersed. Feeling uneasy, in an act that saved lives, Lieutenant Colonel J.J. Jim Shelton, who passed as we heard today, ordered his men to dig in. Most had time to dig individual shell scrapes less than a metre deep. The gunners of 102 Battery had dug theirs only 15 centimetres when they were ordered to stand to. Sporadic enemy contacts marked Australian positions by return fire. The divisional NVA commander ordered a battalion and 2 infiltration groups to attack the Australians before they settled in. Close to 2:30 in the morning, all hell broke loose. Rocket and mortar fire fell onto the base. 102 Field Battery and 1 RAR mortar platoon enduring the heaviest fire. 5 minutes of intense fire, a 10-minute pause, and then the North Vietnamese rushed the Australian position. One soldier shouted to Lieutenant Tony Jensen, "There are 400 Nogs 50 yards away." Bombardier Andy Forsdyke was lying with his M60 machine gun team of 7 men, 20 metres out in front of 102 Field Battery. He said VC got up from all around us, holding their AK-47s up in the air, spraying bullets. Yelling was coming from the mortar section. 2 Australian voices were screaming, "They've got us." But because of the number of VC between us and the mortars, we couldn't help them. In the end, we fired at the VC on the track, and we possibly hit our 2 mortar men. The enemy assault quickly overran the mortars, moving through the position at speed. Artillery gunners began firing over open sights, point blank, into waves of 200 enemy troops. Lieutenant Tony Jensen of the mortar platoon was facing annihilation from the overwhelming force. 2 men sprang from their pits and were killed instantly. Desperate, he ordered direct fire onto his own position from the anti-tank platoon's recoilless rifles. He screamed to his men, "Stay down, Splintex coming in." Thousands of Splintex darts swept across the platoon, clearing everything above ground. Gunner David Tomo Thomas of 102 Field Battery later said, "I will never forget carrying Splintex over the number 4 gun, Steve-O's gun. I tripped and fell down and had a poncho wrapped around my ankles. I looked down and there was Bluey Sawtell. He was dead. He'd been shot in the head and was under the poncho near our gun bay. I covered him up and kept going." One howitzer of 102 Field Battery was overrun, another damaged and abandoned. Desperate close-quarter fighting with grenades regained the captured gun. Helicopter gunships and fighter aircraft delivered support, with the C-47 Spooky illuminating the battlefield with flares and hosing the enemy with fire from multiple miniguns. The last enemy was found and killed at the number 6 gun emplacement just after 6 a.m. 11 Australians had been killed and 28 wounded. Their average age was 22. Over almost 4 weeks of further actions at Coral, and the nearby fire support base of Balmoral. Australians fought some of the largest and most sustained battles of the Australian War in Vietnam. At its end would be 26 Australians dead, 100 wounded. Together, they repelled a massive attack and accounted for more than 300 enemy dead. None who survived would ever be the same again. Robin Carbons was a member of 3RAR, and on the 23rd of May, his 23rd birthday, he was inserted into Balmoral. The next day they came under heavy attack. He completed his tour, returned to Australia, but was ashamed to tell anyone he was a Vietnam veteran. He had 13 jobs in 2 years, describing Vietnam as the dirty war. He married, divorced, and remarried, and when a mate asked him if he would march on Anzac Day, Denise, his then wife of 10 years, said, "Why would he do that?" And he turned to her and said, "Because I'm a Vietnam veteran." He had never told her. And of this, he said recently, "It's been a long journey with PTSD. I spent 30 years trying to forget about the war. I still have nightmares and bad days, but I've come to terms with it." A unit citation for gallantry has been finally awarded to you, these men of Coral Balmoral, and many civilians here will wonder, well, what on earth does that mean? Well, it means this. Bob Wilson was 17 years old in 1963 when he joined the Army. He'd never heard of Vietnam, had no idea where it was, he said. He fought in these actions, and of the belated award, he said last week, "It feels like a great weight has been lifted off my shoulders. This is not about personal recognition. These are battle honours for our unit. We can carry the colours on our flag and all the young blokes can wear the citation. When we came back, World War II veterans didn't want to know us, turned their backs. We want to make sure the young ones get proper help and are well cared for. This citation is a part of that. I'm terrified of crowds. I can't go to Anzac Day dawn service. But when I'm with these blokes, it's like a pair of old slippers. I can relax." The wife of one of you said this of her husband's reaction to the news: "It's not often that he shows his emotions like that. He had a big cry after speaking to you, and it was good that he was able to let it out. Thank you for being there for him. You always have been. I think you are all very, very brave," she said, "to have not only survived there in Vietnam, but for all those years that have followed. Australia owes you a great deal, and we do." It's tempting, human beings that we are, to settle for headlines, broad brushstrokes of our history, popular imagery and mythology. Our comfortable lives breed easy indifference to individual sacrifices made in our name, devotion to duty and to our country. Corporal Alan Jack Parr of 1RAR's mortar platoon was there 50 years ago today, calling in the Splintex fire in his own position at Coral. And only last week he said this to us: "Numerous times I've stood in front of the Vietnam Roll of Honour and I've read our names. I come to John O'Brien and dwell some time. He died in my shallow shell scrape next to me. Bob Hickey was 5 metres away. Jock W 10 metres away, as was Errol Bailey and Tiny Watson. I think to myself, just what more could I have done to have saved them? It happened so quickly. Then there were the 8 wounded, some of whom are still with us. We still see their faces. We still hear their voices. We know what pain and grief their passing caused and still causes. I console myself by saying, well, what I did was enough to prevent another 8 names or 13 more appearing on the panel. I feel a bit better. I move on and I don't look back and I give thanks. But I pledge that I will do everything possible until my dying day to ensure that their sacrifice and service to our great nation is remembered and honoured. To young Australians, these Vietnam veterans amongst us, like you, were once young. Yet out of a sense of duty to our country, they gave their innocent youth, 521 of their friends, their lives, and thousands more their good physical and mental health for us. We will honour them best, not by floral tributes, but the way we live our lives and shape our nation. To fail in this will be to diminish ourselves and demean the values that bind us, that make us Australians, for which you all gave so much that is so precious. For we are young and we are free. Those 26 names. Private Errol John Bailey, 13th of May, 1968, aged 23. Corporal Robert Bernard Hickey, 13th of May, 1968, aged 24. Sergeant Peter Edward Lewis, 13th of May 1968, aged 24. Private Robert Leo McNabb, 13th of May 1968, aged 20. Private John Alfred O'Brien, 13th of May 1968, aged 21. Gunner Christopher James Sawtell, 13th of May 1968, aged 19. Gunner Ian James Scott, 13th of May 1968, age 21. Private Lawrence Rodney Shepherd, 13th of May 1968, age 22. Private Bevan Maxwell Trimble, 13th of May 1968, age 21. Private Richard Christopher A. Watson, 13th of May 1968, age 20. Corporal John Hunter Witten, 13th of May 1968, age 28. Corporal Ian Kenneth Dawson, 14th May 1968, age 24. Private Christopher Robert Nisbet, 14 May 1968, age 20. Corporal John Gregory Stinson Pearce, 14 May 1968, age 22. Lance Corporal William Henry Martin, 16 May 1968, age 22. Private Alan John Wallace, 16 May 1968, age 21. Private Harry Winston White, 16 May 1968, age 23. Signalman Alexander Henry Young, 16 May 1968, age 21. Private Brian Thomas Young, 16 May 1968, age 21. Major George Alfred Constable, 23 May 1968, age 32. Private Lindsay Noel Brown, 26 May 1968, age 22. Private Alan John Cooper, 26 May 1968, age 20. Private John Walter Desney, 26 May 1968, age 22. Private William Malcolm Thomas, 26 May 1968, age 21. Private Jeffrey Thomas Wall, 28 May 1968, age 21. Private Dal Edward Abbott, 30 May 1968, age 21.
Thank you, Dr. Nelson. I invite you all to please stand and join in singing the national anthem.
Party attention. Party present. Arms.
The Australian War Memorial was the vision of Charles Bean, Australia's First World War official historian. Bean landed with the Australian troops on Gallipoli and stayed with them at the front through to the end of the war. The idea of this national memorial and museum came to him at Pozières, France, in the depths of the bloody fighting of 1916. Bean's idea was that this would be a place where families and friends could mourn loved ones buried in faraway places. It would also be a place that could help all Australians understand what these men and women had endured and what they had done for us. Bean's vision, to which we remain true, is best expressed as inscribed in the entrance to the memorial's galleries. Here is their spirit, in the heart of the land they loved, and here we guard the record which they themselves made. Tonight we'll read the story behind just one of those on the Roll of Honour, which lists the names of more than 102,000 men and women who have given their lives for us in war and operations over more than a century. But first, we present a lament, Flowers of the Forest. Wreaths and floral tributes will now be laid at the base of the Pool of Reflection in the following order. Mrs. Barbara Landgraf, sister of Corporal Robert Hickey, and the surviving members of the Mortar Platoon of the 1st Battalion Royal Australian Regiment. The families of the men who also fell at the battles of Coral, Balmoral. Mr Jeremy Hanson, representing the Minister for Veterans Affairs, and the Honourable Miss Amanda Rishworth, Shadow Minister for Veterans Affairs. Air Chief Marshal Mark Binskin, Chief of Defence Force. General Sir Philip Bennett, Commanding Officer of the 1st Battalion Royal Australian Regiment at FSB Coral Balmoral, with Lieutenant Colonel Ben McLennan, Commanding Officer of the 1st Battalion Royal Australian Regiment, and Brigadier John Robbins, representing the Commanding Officer of the 3rd Battalion Royal Australian Regiment at FSB Coral Balmoral, with Lieutenant Colonel Mick Kearns, Commanding Officer of the 3rd Battalion Royal Australian Regiment. Lieutenant General Angus Campbell, Chief of Army, and Warrant Officer Don Spinks, Regimental Sergeant Major, Army. Wing Commander Sharon Bowen, on behalf of the Council of the Australian War Memorial, and the Honourable Dr Brenda Nelson, Director of the Australian War Memorial. Veterans of the 1st Battalion Royal Australian Regiment, representing A Company, Mr Lindsay Dalton, B Company, Mr Michael Bolotho, C Company, Mr Keith Brunette, and D Company, Mr Ray Curtis. Representing the veterans of the 1st Field Squadron, Royal Australian Engineers, 104 Signal Squadron, Royal Australian Corps of Signallers, and the 12th Field Regiment, Royal Australian of the Australian Artillery, Miss Meg Sortell. Mr Ken Foster, National President of the Vietnam Veterans Association of Australia, and Mr Richard Crenner, Chairman, Legacy Australia Incorporated and veteran of 102 Field Battery. Mr John King, President, ACT Branch of the Returned and Services League of Australia.
Today we remember and pay tribute to Corporal Robert Bernard Hickey. Known as Bob, Robert Hickey was born on the 24th of October 1943 in the Sydney suburb of Punchbowl. Growing up, he attended Kempsey High School, gaining his intermediate certificate in 1959. One of his main interests was building model aircraft. Before joining the Australian Regular Army, Hickey had been living at home in Marylands and working as a storeman and parts salesman for Kell and Piper Proprietary Limited, an automotive service company. He joined the Army on the 11th of May 1964. After completing basic training and initial employment training as a rifleman, he was posted to the 1st Battalion, the Royal Australian Regiment. Arriving in Holsworth in early December 1964, he was posted to B Company. 1 RAR was split to help raise 5 RAR in March 1965, and at the end of April, Prime Minister Robert Menzies announced that 1 RAR was going to be deployed to Vietnam. The men of 1 RAR began intensive training. On the 12th of May, during a leave break, Hickey married his sweetheart, Margaret June Adams, at the Registrar General's office in Sydney. Hickey and his comrades flew out from Richmond Air Base on the 7th of June. After a stop in Townsville, they flew on to Saigon, arriving the following day. 1 RAR served as the 3rd Battalion of the US Army's 173rd Airborne Brigade and were based at Bien Hoa. The Australians took part in their first major operation at the end of the month. Despite early equipment and stores issues and differences with the Americans in approach to training and warfare, 1 RAR performed its job well. 1 RAR was replaced at the end of its tour by the 1st Australian Task Force, with 2 battalions, 5 RAR and 6 RAR, deploying to Vietnam in May and June 1966. The men of 1 RAR returned to Australia, where many found adjusting back to peacetime very difficult. For Hickey, life was still busy. Over the following year, he passed several promotion courses, which saw him promoted to Lance Corporal in October and then Temporary Corporal in February 1967. Further courses and promotions followed during 1967. Hickey was promoted to Corporal in September and spent some time as an acting platoon sergeant. He and Margaret spent as much time together as Army life allowed, and their son David was born in early April 1967. By the start of 1968, 1 RAR had been warned for service in Vietnam and preparations began for the battalion's second tour. On learning that her husband would once again be deploying to Vietnam, Margaret began to experience recurring nightmares of her husband's death. She was so upset by these dreams, she visited the battalion's chaplain. Given her concerns and the fact that she was pregnant with their second child, Hickey was transferred as a section commander to the mortar platoon in Support Company. It was felt that this platoon would be the safest option for him on his second deployment. Corporal Hickey arrived in Vietnam with 1 RAR's main element in early April 1968. After a shakedown operation, 1 RAR was involved in Operation Blacksland at the end of April, successfully locating and destroying enemy camps in the Nguyen Dinh Hills. This was followed immediately after by Operation Tuan Tang. With enemy forces withdrawing from Saigon following a devastating offensive, the 1st Australian Task Force was directed to assist in cutting off the enemy's escape. The Australians began deploying into their area of operations on the 12th of May. The 1st Australian Task Force had never conducted an operation on this scale before, and the insertion of troops was beset by delays and confusion. Nearby enemy soldiers observed the Australian deployment to the open area that was going to become Fire Support Patrol Base Coral and began their preparations for a large-scale attack. It took most of the afternoon for 1RR to be airlifted to Fire Support and Patrol Base Coral. Defensive positions were being hastily dug, but due to the size of the base and the deployment of the rifle companies, the 1RR mortar platoon and 102 field battery were left dangerously exposed. This weakness was pinpointed by the enemy. The Australians experienced several enemy contacts during the evening, which were later realised to be probing attacks. Around 2:30 a.m, Corporal Hickey reported to his platoon commander that he could hear about 450 metres away. Men were woken and stood to, awaiting the assault. Hickey's platoon commander tried to convince his superior that an attack was underway, but was initially met with scepticism. At around 3:30 a.m, rocket and mortar fire fell on Fire Support and Patrol Base Coral, with the heaviest concentration falling on 102 field battery and 1RR's mortar platoon. Corporal Hickey and several of his comrades were killed instantly. The North Vietnamese Main Force regiments then began their assault soon after, advancing in waves against the Australian position. All of the mortar platoon pits, along with one gun of 102 field battery, were overrun. Another gun was put out of action. The remaining guns of 102 battery fired splintex and high explosive rounds directly into the enemy soldiers, saving the surviving members of 1RR's mortar platoon. Further support came from the recoilless rifles of 1RR's anti-tank platoon, 3RR's mortars, New Zealand's 161 battery, Huey Cobra gunships, and Douglas AC-47 gunships known by the call sign Spooky. By 6:30 a.m, the enemy had been driven back with heavy losses, and the defenders of Fire Support Patrol Base Coral could take stock. 1RR had suffered heavy losses. Of the 18 men in the mortar platoon, 5 had been killed, including Corporal Hickey, and a further 8 wounded. In all, 11 Australians had been killed and a further 28 wounded. Hickey's remains were returned to Australia and he was accorded a funeral with full military honours. He was laid to rest in Rookwood Cemetery. He was 24 years old. His name is listed on the Roll of Honour on your right, along with more than 500 others from the Vietnam War, and his photograph is displayed today beside the pool of reflection. We now remember Corporal Robert Bernard Hickey, who gave his life for us, for our freedoms, and in the hope of a better world.
Please stand for the reading of the ode and the sounding of the last post.
Party shoulder, arms. Catafalque party present, arms.
They shall grow not old, as we who are left grow old. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them.
We will remember them.
shoulder, arms. Catafalque party outwards. Turn. Catafalque party quick. Arch.
Lest we forget. We leave you this evening with the words of the memorial's founder, Charles Bean. Many a man lying out there at Pozières or in the low scrub at Gallipoli, with his poor, tired senses barely working through the fever of his brain, has thought in his last moments, well, it's over. But in Australia, they will be proud of this. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes this evening's last post ceremony. I do ask that the Coral and Balmoral veterans and families remain in the commemorative area, please. To all our other visitors, we thank you for visiting the Australian War Memorial and wish you a very good evening. Please follow the directions of the memorial staff as you exit the building. Thank you.